Okay, we're going to talk about how to take notes in reading that are going to be useful to you and then are going to be analytic. So here's the first page of Imagine Communities. This text is really hard, really dense, the sentences are long, it's a complicated work. This is not going to be the last complicated work that you hit, and so the purpose of having this, well, there's two purposes. One of the reasons why we want this in the class is because this is the central text about national identity that exists today. And so if we're talking about national identity in this class, it's important that you understand the concepts. Now I could just condense these into a lecture and talk to you about them, but I wanted you to read the actual material because I want you to know how to read a really complex text. Because when you hit one in your major where it really matters, you're going to need to know how to do this. So here we have this text, and we're going to just sort of start reading through it. Perhaps without being much noticed yet, a fundamental transformation in the history of Marxism and Marxist movements is upon us. Okay, so that is a statement, and that is about Marxism. So what I'm going to do in my notes is I'm going to underline Marxism and Marxist, and I'm going to make a little note that says why, this is about nationalism, why Marxism? Now I'm doing this on an iPad, and so it's my handwriting is going to be terrible, but you'll get the idea about it's not important that you can read it, it's important that you understand what I'm doing. So the first thing that I want to know is why is he doing that? So that's using my critical thinking because I'm engaged, I'm alive, I'm thinking about this text. I'm not just like, okay, blah, 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 blah. I'm thinking, okay, this is a text about nationalism. That's what Professor Kaplan said, that this is about nationalism. So why are we talking about Marxism? Okay, let's read on. Its most visible signs. And what is it saying? There's a transformation in the history of Marxism and Marxist movements. And the signs are, so this is evidence. He's made a point that there's a fundamental transformation in the history of Marxism. And then he's going to give us some evidence. And the evidence is recent wars. Wars are world historical importance because they're the first to occur between regimes whose independence and revolutionary credentials are undeniable, and because none of the belligerents has made more than the most perfunctory attempts to justify the bloodshed in terms of a recognizable Marxist theoretical perspective. So what's he saying there? Well, he's saying that there's a transformation in the history of Marxism and Marxist movements. The example is wars between Vietnam, Cambodia, and China, because none of them is justifying it in terms of a Marxist theoretical perspective. Well, I'm still wondering, who cares? Well, it was still just possible to interpret the Sino-Soviet border clashes of 1969 and blah, 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 blah. So here's some more evidence. I'm just going to write an E for evidence. In terms of social imperialism, defending socialism, no one can seriously believe that such vocabularies would have much bearing on what's occurred in Indochina. And, okay, so basically, what I'm going to say here, I'm going to kind of like write a summary of this paragraph, that Marxism is changing, and the evidence is Indo-China wars compared to the Soviet military interventions. Okay, so that they're not, the point here is that they're not, those ones were about this list of things here. But Indochina is not about those ideas, which are Marxist ideas, so it's about something else. Okay, if the Vietnamese invasion and occupation of Cambodia in December, blah, 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 represented the first large-scale conventional war waged by one revolutionary Marxist regime against another, China's assault on Vietnam rapidly confirmed the precedent. Only the most trusting would dare wager that in the declining years of this century, any significant outbreak of interstate hostilities will necessarily find the USSR and the PRC, let alone the smaller social states, supporting or fighting on the same side. Who can be confident that Yugoslavia and Albania will not one day come to blows? So what's that saying? That's saying that those variegated groups who seek a withdrawal, so this is more evidence, Those variegated groups who seek a withdrawal of the Red Army from its various encampments in Eastern Europe should remind themselves of the degree to which its overwhelming presence has, since 1945, ruled out armed conflicts between the region's Marxist regimes. Such consideration serves to underline the fact that since World War II, every successful revolution has defined itself in national terms. So he's making an argument, something about Marxism, and something about Marxism versus national terms. Now, I'm thought about this one because we're talking about nationalism, and that's the first time that we've mentioned it. So these things must be in opposition. Nationalism versus Marxism. The People's Republic of China, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. So we've got national terms in what's supposed to be Marxist, so it's grounded itself firmly in territorial and social place. Conversely, the fact that the Soviet Union shares with the United Kingdom the rare distinction of refusing nationality in its name suggests that it is much a legatee of the pre-nationalistic dynastic states as a precursor of a 21st century internationalist order. So he's saying that the communism should have been an internationalist, except that a bunch of these have still defined themselves in terms of nationalism. So this is evidence of something. Eric Hobsbawm, who we're going to read in the next reading, is perfectly correct in stating that Marxist movements and states have tended to become national, not only in form but in substance, i.e. nationalist. There's nothing to suggest that this train will not continue, nor is the tendency confined to the socialist world. Almost every year the United Nations admits new members, and many old nations, one thought fully consolidated, find themselves challenged by subnationalisms within their borders. This is a trend. Now, this was written in 1983, and this is a trend that has continued, right till today. Nationalisms which naturally dream of shedding the subness one happy day. The reality is quite plain. The end of the era of nationalism, so long prophesied. So here, what's he doing here? He is making an argument in contrast to an argument that has been so long prophesied that other people have said. So he's saying basically that he's arguing against the idea that nationalism is dying in favor of these internationalist movements. Indeed, nationist is the most universally legitimate value in the life of our time. But if facts are clear, their explanation remains a matter of long-standing dispute. Nation, nationality, nationalism all have proved notoriously difficult to define, let alone to analyze. In contrast to the immense influence that nationalism has exerted on the modern world, plausible theory about it is that it's conspicuously meager. So what's he saying there? He's saying that the facts are clear, the explanation is long-standing dispute. And all of these things are hard to define, let alone to analyze. In contrast to the immense influence, there's very little amount. And now he's talking about people who have said something about it. Hugh Seton Watson. And he gives you another one, Tom Nairn. And he's telling you what those things are saying. And so he's giving you evidence of what he just said, which is that it's there isn't a whole lot of it, and he gives you two of the examples of people who have written about this, and he gives you their credentials, and he tells him that, and he quotes this guy who's got good credentials saying that there's no scientific definition. And then he quotes another guy, and he gives you his credentials, who says the theory of nationalism represents Marxism's great historical failure. But even this confession is somewhat misleading insofar as it can be taken to imply the regrettable outcome of a long self-conscious search for theoretical clarity. More exact to say that nationalism has proved an uncomfortable anomaly for Marxist theory, and precisely for that reason has been largely elided rather than confronted. How else to explain Marx's failure to explicate the crucial adjective? So somehow he's taking Marxism versus nationalism, and he is thinking about that there's something going on between the two of these things, and he's trying to help us understand what this long-standing controversy is about. In the next page, he's continuing to explain why Marxism hasn't dealt with this. So now I'm going to draw a line right here, because right here we switch. That was all introduction, and in his introduction he's talking about Marxism versus nationalism, and then suddenly he gives another, he's switching, and I see it because he's given you language that tells you something, he's shifting. He was talking about this large debate, he gave you some information about people who participated in that debate, and now he's trying to give you his own position. The aim of this book is to offer some tentative suggestions for a more satisfactory interpretation of the anomaly of nationalism. My sense, so again he's clearing space for his own argument, is that on this topic both Marxist and liberal theory have become etiolated, and you'll probably need to look that up. So I would circle it so I could look it up if I didn't have it, if I didn't have a dictionary right near me, in a late Ptolemaic effort to save the phenomena, and that a reorientation of perspective in, as it were, a Copernican spirit is urgently required. All right, this is not something that's going to be easy to understand, but let's keep going and see if we can kind of get its point without having to look it all up. My point of departure is that nationality, or as one might prefer to put it in the view of the nation of the word's multiple significations, nationness as well as nationalism, are cultural artifacts of a particular kind. Now this looks pretty important because he calls it his point of departure. So this is where he's starting from. So this is like his kind of base idea. Now you can't really see my writing because I'm trying to use a stylus on a little iPad mini, but you get the idea. So I'm writing here on the side. Here's the base idea, and then this one I'm going to want to highlight in some way. Nationness is a cultural artifact of a particular kind. To understand them properly, we need to consider how carefully they've come into historical being, in what ways their meaning. So these are the questions he's going to undertake, and why today they command such profound emotional legitimacy. I'll be trying to argue. Okay, I'll be trying to argue. That sounds pretty important. So I'm going to underline that the creation of these artifacts towards the end of the 18th century was the spontaneous distillation of a complex crossing of discrete historical forces. So he's going to be arguing that the reason why nationalism was created because of these discrete historical forces, but that once created they became modular, capable of being transplanted with varying degrees of self-consciousness to a great variety of social terrains, to merge and be merged. So basically there was this moment where these historical forces came together to create this idea of nationalism, but that once that it was created, they were transplanted to merge and be merged with a correspondingly wide variety of political and ideological constellations. I will also attempt to show why these particular cultural artifacts have aroused such deep attachments. So here's a second discrete, which means that you can pull it out. Here's a second thing that he's trying to do. Before addressing the questions raised above, it seems advisable to consider briefly the concept of nation, offer a workable definition. So here we have definition. And then he's going to go through. Now I'm not going to keep going because what I want you to do is I want you to keep going. And I want you to be thinking about what here is introduction, and I want you to be thinking about what here is his thesis, and you can even look in his paragraphs and see that he has a point and then he uses evidence to make that point. You don't need to understand the evidence to understand the argument. So one of the ways that you can learn how to skim, but doing it not just skimming and just, my eyes are roaming over the page and nothing's penetrating my brain, but skimming in a useful way, you can understand what his argument is by looking for the places where he is making his argument, analyzing, which means to sort of pull apart the parts where he is making his argument from the parts where he is giving evidence. Because you don't need to understand his evidence to see his argument. You need to understand his evidence to evaluate his argument, to see whether or not you believe it's true, but you don't need his evidence to understand his argument because he makes it and then he gives you examples that support it. Now one of the problems is that this book is written for academics, for people who have a pretty good command of the social and political trends that were happening. It's also, although it's a central text, it is from the 80s, and so some of the things that he talks about, like the recent wars in Indochina, they're not very recent because they were actually well before you were born. So those examples may not be helping you to understand the points he's making, but you don't need to know them. You need to know what is evidence in order to know that this is not an important part what you're trying to do, which is to grasp his overall argument. What you need to do is figure out what his overall argument. So what we've done so far is we've figured out that he has this introduction where he seems to be contrasting nationalism with Marxism, and then he's told you what it is he's trying to do, and now he's shifted and he's talking about definitions. So that is a kind of note-taking that's analytic. I am breaking this thing into its parts. I'm breaking the introduction from his statement of his argument to his part about definitions, and I'm also breaking up some of the paragraphs into where's the point he's making in this paragraph and where's the evidence, in order that I can focus on trying to understand his argument and not so worried about whether or not it's convincing. And that's where we're going to stop. But what I want you to do for the rest of the article is I want you to try to analyze it in those ways. I want you to identify what's important, and then I want you to try to understand it. So what I kept doing, and I was doing it verbally, if I was writing, I might write it in the text, or I might get with a group of people and try to like explain these sentences to each other. That might involve, in some cases, looking up words. And then trying to, maybe if you've got a group of people, maybe somebody has some history background and maybe knows what those wars are, or maybe somebody understands what Marxism is a little bit and so can explain it, and all of those things will help you understand it. But this is how you have to tackle a really hard text. You need to do it kind of line by line, you need to do it very analytically, and you need to make sure that you are understanding what it is that you're reading and which parts are important to focus on and which parts are not. Good luck.